Well, yes, welcome everyone to GeoHug. So, before we kick off today's session, I'd just like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional lands which we're all coming from today. I'm here on the beautiful lands of the Gadigal of the people of the Aurora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future. So, I'm so happy to have Jessie Clark with us today. So, Jessie is an economic geologist with more than 8 years' experience in mining and resource geology, exploration, and business development. So he started his career with BHP's Olympic Dam until 2021 as their principal geoscientist. He's currently the mineral resource manager for Barrick Gold, where his focus is to support the Nevada Gold Mines joint venture to create long term value by underpinning business development and operational opportunities with world class geological models. And I cannot wait to hear from him today about the importance of domaining from a geologist's perspective. So it is going to be an awesome session. Please use the chat. We'll open up the floor for discussions at the end. And yes, thanks so much, Jessie. It's amazing having you.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's a real privilege to present on GeoHug. You've done an excellent job with this platform.
Oh, thanks.
And unlike traditional technical talks, which can be quite dry, the comedic value adds a little bit of a alternative flair. So I was a little stumped about what to present when I got this initial invitation, but peer consensus suggested I discuss the importance of domaining. Now, the disclaimer here is I am not a practitioner of resource geology. I'm not a geostatistician. I don't publicly report any result. I'm not a competent person for any publicly declared resources. So I can say some bold claims without too much direct responsibility, I guess. But this is really from a geologist perspective. And it's drawing on my experience from, principally two major mature tier one districts, one being IOCGs in South Australia, and now more recently in my life, Carlin Systems in Nevada, but a plethora of other projects and deposit types that I've been fortunate to look at along the way. And it's also drawing from my experience of managing and building geologic modeling teams and and how they've become quite a significant component of traditional mine geology teams in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So today I just wanted to go through a little bit of the philosophical part about why estimation domains are important from my perspective, and go through a little bit back to basics. So in this talk, I'm not going to talk about any machine learning algorithms or any fancy doodads and hoo-has. I am really just going back to basic fundamental geology here and putting a bit of a call out to flag the importance of this very forgotten and undervalued part of the geologic workflow that is real estimation domaining. And I'll go through several case studies, a couple from Nevada and a couple from literature that I've pulled out. So I'm not expert to those deposits, but there's a couple of really good case studies out there in literature that I thought I'd share. And it sort of goes through a bit of the process and the workflow that I look at and get our teams to look at and go through. So to begin with, I always like to throw a little bit of a sticky quote out there, but I always enjoy a good quote. And Dave Lowell is he was a very successful explorationist, and while he wasn't a geologist specifically by trade, he was a mining engineer. He found a lot of the world's biggest ore bodies. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it as a side note. But he had this really great quote out of an interview a few years ago, which went, lots of geologists know a great deal about geology, do not know very much about how profit is made. This is my jam. I really enjoy trying to find where we can add and generate the biggest value. And where you make the biggest value in this industry is when you pull discoveries through feasibility and into production. But having worked mostly in mature districts where the assets have been in production for many years to plus 20 years, 30 years, what I find is that this value curve plateaus at certain point, and eventually over time, unless you tender it like a garden and watch out for complacency, this will eventually decline. And to me, this all comes down to ore body knowledge in the most practical sense. Where are the biggest bang for buck value items we can get that we can pull from understanding the geology better? And so this is all about everything we mine to try and make it the highest quality ore reserve to maximize that value. And this is where I have lots of fun, because there is actually this huge value opportunity that's sort of forgotten in these mature districts. And it's all about trying to understand where to pull that value. In my opinion, estimation domains have proven to be quite a valuable workflow to go and tackle and get right. And why do I think that? So this is where we go through a little bit of back to basics foundations, but you know, we all understand in a mining environment, we operate within a broader value chain. There are good things and bad things out of that. In the most simplistic sense, when you step back, it is quite a linear system. Geoscience is typically at the forefront. And the problem there is the more disciplined we get, the more transactional we become between all of our stakeholders. And the biggest transactional relationship that I have found is between the geologists and the resource geologists or geostatisticians. This exists, I'm focusing on geoscience here, but what we must always try and overcome, especially in these older districts that may have very strong culture ingrained of how they've always done things, is particularly as we move towards non-traditional rosters and job sharing and back-to-back geologists and fly in, fly out scenarios, what we're losing is the continuity and more project-like thinking of how the ore body is actually being formed and understanding its geometries and all of the geological relationships. But also what we find is the teams are getting more and more functionalized, and this is putting up silo barriers between these groups. So I just want to stress that I think this is a bit of a root cause. This is a typical point of disconnection, but I strongly feel that if we take on seriously a extension of the geologic modeling to resource modeling workflow, where we're critically looking for geologically founded and robust estimation domains, this is really the ultimate link to rejoin these groups again. And so I'm going to go through a couple of case studies, and I'm going to go through a couple of examples from literature where that link is clearly broken, but the case studies are going to be productive case studies where it's worked really well. And we'll go through a few of those. But first, I'll just quickly go through what is an estimation domain. There's a few definitions out there. Mario Rossi and Clayton Deutsch have their really excellent mineral resource estimation textbook. They have a whole chapter on estimation domaining. It's very good. It's an excellent resource. They define an estimation domain probably pretty well among all, but as a volume of rock with mineralization controls that result in approximate homogeneous distributions of mineralization in stationary zones. A bit wordy. Clayton, Ian Glacken and Snowden, very similar, just a much older paper. René Sturck and his colleagues had a really good paper out a few years ago on domains. And they had I thought it was quite a good and slightly different approach to their definition, which is where we have 3D shapes that assume that the controls of mineralization are monogenetic, and within which the data have no trends and therefore are a monomodal distribution. Scott Dunham has a lot of excellent resources on his website. They're extremely insightful and comical, so I highly recommend that. He has this excellent comment on domains where the data is meant to be apples and apples, not apples and oranges, but always assuming that the possibility of a plum may actually exist, because this is geology and it's variable. Jackie Coombs has done so much work in this space. This is quite a niche. It's quite a niche topic, estimation domaining. And Jackie Coombs has lots of publications and books out there. And really it summarizes it quite nicely, where the geology is consistent. It's a single grade population, has a single orientation for search. These are just all basic definitions. The critical thing to pull out here though, is an estimation domain is defined by a set of mineral controls that typically contain more than one geological variable or geologic domain. And so really, what we're looking for is the best collation of our ore body knowledge into a single three-dimensional product or products that represent that mineralization control. So I will acknowledge my colleague and friend Matthew Sampson on this slide. He summarized it so well, I just stole it directly from him. But you know, kudos to him. Why do we domain? Well, in the definitions, we went through a couple of terms that are very specific to geostats. So for everyone, so we're on the same page before we move forward, stationary domains, we're really talking about, there's two orders of stationarity. One, which is where we typically focus our attention, which is the mean of the domain is constant throughout the domain. That is, we have a homogeneous population. So we must question, does it make sense to pull this data together? And it also doesn't necessarily mean that the grade is constant throughout that domain. And most importantly, and to Sturk et al.'s point about monogenetic mineralization distribution, is really that the variogram is constant throughout the domain. There's no hidden secondary or tertiary mineral trends within that domain that spatially don't make sense. So they're there to facilitate spatial prediction during resource estimation, where the estimation parameters and reference statistics will make sense throughout that domain because it is a homogeneous population. So typically we find that they don't equal geological domains. It should make geological sense. This should be spatially logical, and they're typically defined by mineralization controls. And more importantly, as we estimate different elements, which is really common, it's not necessarily apples and apples between the different elements, especially if you have a set of geometallurgical domains that also require estimation. So that's just basics. You can pull all of those definitions in much greater detail in a reference list I have at the back end of the slide deck. What I really want to go through now is sort of the rewards and pitfalls of common and potential best practice. So domaining is that critical step where we go from observations to inferences. And the best analogy I always like is this one where it sits subconsciously in my mind since I've read it. So I don't remember who I stole it from, but I think it might have been Eric Ronald in one of his LinkedIn posts, but I can't acknowledge who I got it from or who they stole it from. But you observe a person who cannot walk a straight line, whose speech is slurred and smells strongly of alcohol. You infer that person is drunk. You may not have seen them drink alcohol or analyze their blood alcohol level. So this is really the critical step. As we build geological models, we're typically focused on trying to pull out the focused geologic observations of lithology, of structure, of alteration. And now that we have very easily accessible implicit modeling tools, we can put in those data sets, those raw observations, and spit out a fairly decent interpretation. However, it's not necessarily always correct, and it's not necessarily the end all, because that's just really the beginning of the foundation. So let me just get rid of that. I want to turn to René's paper back in 2019, just to give some context on I'm not alone in thinking that one, estimation domains are critical, but two, from everything I've seen, and obviously from what Rene and his colleagues have seen, there is a huge knowledge and skills gap. There's clearly no industry standard guidelines on how to do domaining, and there is a real lack of best practice examples. I really struggle to find good case studies. You usually have to dig quite deep into conference proceedings, typically mostly from AusIM mine geology conferences, where it's very specific themes. But some of their key conclusions here was the use of geological information to create domains is the exception rather than the rule. And while we have invested so much time and energy, and we've gone through lots of, there's so much literature on it now since the 90s when nonlinear estimation techniques really started to blow up. Almost all of the maiden resource publicly announced projects that this paper looked at, which is 161 different case studies, almost all of them use traditional linear estimation techniques. The majority of them had a grade shell as their domain. And rather concerningly, the majority of them basically had no to very weak geological support and was nominally based on statistics. So you really have to question, what are these domains representing? And even more surprising was the supermajority of them were done by traditional explicit modeling. So I have a few explanations for some of these things that I'll go through, but just one thing I find interesting, I like to look at these Google Trends and Google Books viewers. And it's really clear to see here that within books and publications that Google has access to, and Google searches that people search, resource domains have taken the back seat in the last 10 years. They're not so popular with Google anymore. We can see through the early 2000s, and whether this is in response to the sort of increase in nonlinear estimation and workshops and papers that came through the 90s, or when implicit modeling started to kick around in the early 2000s to mid 2000s. But we've really sort of plateaued and declined in that trend. And then here we look at gold shells, both in books and publications and their Google searches. They've exploded in the last 10 years. Ordinary kriging has creeped back up, and indicator kriging as an example of a nonlinear estimation technique, which arguably you'd like to use instead of a nested grade shell and an OK estimate, has declined. So there's lots of different trends I pull out here. And it seems like we've gone back to our comfortable ways of how we used to do things. And I'm not necessarily sure we're really pushing barriers. So while I'm not talking about machine learning algorithms or anything like that of these new techniques, but they certainly exist, and there's only a few examples out there which show the value in doing those. The biggest value is you can spit out lots of different case examples very quickly, which is the value with implicit modeling. But the key thing out of Rene's paper was the geology, while we all agree it matters, it's still not really making its way into domains. And one of the best quotes around that everyone uses is Harry Parker, which is an absolute classic. An ounce of geology is worth a pound of geostatistics. Maybe disappointing to geostatisticians with no geological background. Tough. One of the best Parkerisms around. Everyone uses it. And when you go and do a geostatistical workshop, or you look in any geostatistical books, they all comment about how important geology is, and they usually reference this quote. But what does it actually mean? And we'll go through some case studies where I hope I bring it back to the geology, but this is where it'd be really good if all of us in industry who may be going through and reviving estimation domains, or have a really good workflow for continuous improvement in estimation domain space, to start sharing some of those best practice workflows out there. So how do we really get geology in. It all starts with good geology. And the ultimate question that I always challenge everyone to answer is, why is the mineralization where it is today? And when we think in exploration and we think in growth, we always think in a more holistic mineral system science framework. And I have here Carlin system, but this is really any epigenetic hydrothermal system. These mineralized zones are the product of intense hydrothermal fluid rock interaction. They're transported along favorable conduits, whether they're district scale structures or rheological or redox contacts along sills, and we trap mineralization along fertile zones, whether they were preconditioned before the mineralizing event or during the mineralizing event, but they're focused along these trap sites. And so that's perfect. What it tells us is that there's no single mineral system ingredient that's responsible for the mineralization footprint. So we can absolutely apply mineral system science estimation domains, and we can scale this down all the way down to the GC scale. And so obviously these systems can be quite fractal. Most ore systems are zoned, and typically all you see is, especially in brittle environments, is the more telescope, the more you zoom in to a local scale, it obviously becomes a lot more variable and complicated and geologically complex, but generally the overall district controls still hold true. The important difference there is the geometry of the mineralization can change. And so when we think about Carlin systems, for example, a really important mineral control is stratigraphy. But even though the mineralization's Eocene, we go all the way back to the Devonian, and we talk about the depositional environment and its importance to how that controls mineralization. And it all comes down to depositional environment, and the most favorable horizons form along the slope in slope facies, mixture of siliciclastic and carbonaceous units, where it's a very dynamic environment. You have lots of debris flows, there could be lots of faulting, it's very unstable, but you also have sea level rise and fall over time can have a dramatic effect to the sedimentary redox of all of those facies that are depositing. Now that's really important. What we're really looking for there in simple terms is Fe2+, because we need Fe2+, so when these hydrothermal fluids interact with these more fertile, more reactive units, that we actually initiate the sulfidation reaction, which is what actually traps the gold. And so there we need transcrustal structures. We need those to intersect with these host lithologies. And then you can have first, second, and third order structures that all contribute to that, which in turn also produces alteration. And that alteration can be zoned, it can be haloed, it can be absent, it can be extremely intense, it varies. All of these things contribute to the mineralization footprint. So when we're producing geological models, we can't just stop at these individual geologic domains that we traditionally model. The biggest value is turning all of this ore body knowledge that we've garnered into the 3D products and actually producing an estimation domain that represents this intersection. So I've got a case study. It's a Carlin system. I haven't gone through, I'm not going to give you much context about what system, where it is. To me, it's not that important. This is more about workflow and the process and the things that I look for and the things that the team looks for. We sit down, we have sessions with the geologists and the resource geologists, and it's the best way to get to the result you need to get to. And if you do it together, it's so much faster. But this is all about continuously assessing whether your ore body knowledge has changed and is it still reflected in your estimation domains. Now, here I've just shown two lithologies in this deposit, dark blue and light blue. Keep it simple. I've put a little bit of a very rough doodle for a trace of an anticline fold hinge. And this is all of the drill hole data showing that's above a very low grade. So the blue has been filtered out. But drill holes basically go all the way across and out. They're all angled drill holes. Grade is increasing relative from cold to hot. That's for all future reference pictures. But what we can see here is the majority of this grade, the moderate to higher grades, they're all falling inside and hosted inside of this light blue lithology. But the thing to take note is, while there's all these structures are cut to the plan section, there's all these structures that exist. They're high angle and they're low angle structures. We have a fold. The fold is slightly overturned. And yet we have all of this very high grade gold, not distributed homogeneously. There are internal controls within this subunit that we've modeled. So when we're modeling, we spend a lot of time getting these stratigraphic contacts accurate, which is really good. We also spend time trying to focus on whether we've got the right subfacies in the district nailed. We've got all the structural controls nailed. These are deposit scale structures. They're quite large, they're quite sweeping, and not necessarily always represented by that single plane. But there is a whole bunch of inherent geologic variability that exists in here that we just have not captured yet. And this is really typical of a lot of geological models. Anyway, I'll get to more of that later, but when I look at the just basic statistics of these lithologic domains, I can see very clearly that the light blue is a dominant host. Bear in mind that this is a known district host, and the majority of drilling is actually within this lithologic domain. So as you can see by the count of samples here, there's quite a significant number of samples in its immediate adjacent lithologic subunit. But what we can see here is in the higher grade samples, it hosts over 90% of those samples. So it's clearly a strong mineralization host. And when we look at the univariate statistics, what we can see is, one, if you're not familiar with looking at these are just spikes due to detection limits, or and that can change over years depending on how old the asset is. So you kind of have to repicture those as a distribution of very low grade samples that will tail off here. What you can see here is it's a pretty flat-ish distribution. I've just focused here on showing you what the coefficient of variation is. So to calculate that, it's a standard deviation over the mean. And so as you're looking at this population of any given sample, it's how close to the mean is this population, as any sample to this population. So typically what never exists is a CV of 1. We're always dealing with a CV of much greater than 1. When you go through the limited resource estimation domain textbooks, the target CV is about 2. About 2, you're still maintaining a degree of stationarity, which is the first order stationarity. And Clayton Deutsch's best rule of practice, at least from his textbook, is aim for less than 2.5. Well, this is where you can't just look at statistics alone, obviously. This here is a CV of 2.37, but it doesn't, one, I can see here that this is looking like a bimodal distribution, and you can play with all those spikes due to the detection limit. If you reduce that y-axis legend, you'll see it a little bit more pronounced. Oops. Now, when we're looking here, this is really important. So most metal deposits, they're going to be log normal. They're positively skewed. That's fine. We understand that. So when we're looking at this log normal distribution, just in case you're wondering, what we're seeing here is this combined mean obviously does not reflect the individual means of these two different modal distributions. And so we can first look at this, and we can look back to the 3D geology to make sure that those populations actually make sense. So when we go back and look at the geology and we look at what else have we modeled, what else have we documented in these zones, we can see that there isn't a few alteration products that we can refer to. One being decalcification, which is as the fluid is interacting with any degree of calcareous rocks, it's slightly acidic. And so we're dissolving those calcareous components and we're creating a lot of void space. So we're increasing the permeability. But in turn, when we get intense fluid rock interaction, we can actually produce a lot of excess quartz or silica, and that'll come out right in the core zone as silicified breccia. It's not always there, but in this particular example, we have a good degree of silicified breccia. So when we look at the distribution of these two alteration domains, they are, for the majority part, hosted within this light blue unit. When we break down the statistics of these two alteration domains, we can see the majority of the high-grade samples are actually hosted within the decalcified zones, and there's a bit of an overlap here in the domains, as is also a majority of the samples in the silicified breccia. So this is really good. So now we've got a combination of geologic domains, and we're getting closer towards representing what our potential estimation domain may be. And it makes total sense, because if we go back to the Carlin system, mineral system, and we look at just a schematic alteration section, we can see that we typically have a structure of some descript. And once we hit a reactive horizon, we will begin that fluid rock interaction and eventually create this zone decalcification extent. It's highly variable. And if it continues, we may actually start producing concentrated silicified breccia. What we know is, and some people may focus on one component over the other component, but it's a mixture of these components that actually is the overall host in a mineral footprint. So again, it's this set of mineral controls that contain more than one geological variable. So when we started plotting this up, we just had a little bit of a whiteboard sketch. What we had modeled at the time was we had the stratigraphic unit. Then we started looking at the silicified breccia as its own subdomain. But then we could still see that we were only representing about half of the mineralized samples. So this mineralization footprint hadn't been fully represented yet. So once we dig into it, we start to find that once we get into moderate to intensely decalcified zones, it actually picks up the broad scale of this mineralization footprint. And so we're able to model that as a first pass estimation domain. And the next steps from here is starting to dig into, do we have second order stationarity? So we go through and start assessing all the mineral trends across the entire deposit. This is a small section. So yes, it's honoring a stratiform distribution or stratiform geometry. It is got a primary host of stratigraphy, but it's actually concentrating at this combination of structural control, fluid rock interaction with a particular horizon or subfacies within this unit, which has seen the most intense alteration, which eventually dissipates out. And so a second example of a Carlin system is when we have a really common example here of a disconformable contact. This unit below is quite barren. And we have a couple of subunits of this unit, which is basically all the way up into the sky here in this example, to keep it simple. But all the grade pulls at this boundary, the stratigraphic contact in the hinge of the fold, where there is a couple of major high angle structures here. And so again, it's that combination of geological controls. But when we look at the statistics, we can see that this is very clearly bimodal. And it's got an extremely high CV, so it's clearly got a couple of populations in there. And this is the ultimate test. I'm really just bouncing back here. We're bouncing back between geology and statistics and geology and statistics. And ultimately what we created was right on that stratigraphic contact is where we actually concentrated most mineralization due to the rheological contrast on that contact. Now that contact's long-lived, and it actually has been highly attenuated from shearing through the contractional deformation events, but then it's also butted up against some high angle normal faults. And so when you combine all those components together, and you also assess it against the statistics, we can pull out a very nice estimation domain which honors all of those mineral controls. And we can see here in a contact analysis plot that the gold line plot here is the weighted average grade, and the blue histogram is the number of samples. And so we can see here that we're concentrating all of that mineralization within that combination of geological features. And as we move away, spatially, we're absolutely dropping in gold quite dramatically, very, very sharp boundary. And so another example here, how am I going for time, Jess? Okay. So I just got 2 more case studies and then I'll wrap it up, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. But another good example, so this was in the most recent mine geology conference that OSIM had, and it was on the Spotted Quoll nickel sulfide deposit. I never been here. I've never seen this. I thought it was a really good practical case study. Essentially, for a long while, they used an explicitly generated 0.8 weight% grade shell of nickel. And that 0.8%, you can see here in just this diagram that they had in this section, 0.8 basically incorporated all of the stringer disseminated sulfide as well as the massive matrix sulfide. It lumped it all together and probably dragged in maybe a little bit of the metasedimentary package around it. This was all due to, based on the paper, a poor geological model and overall lack of understanding of the ore body distribution. But in reality, we know mining this, and we know in this specific deposit type in this part of the world in Western Australia, that actually what we actually see is quite a consistent lens of massive nickel sulfide, and then a variable thickness of disseminated and stringer mineralization. Now, the consequence of ignoring that geological control was when they pulled it into a 0.8% grade shell, they basically smoothed the very high grade in the massive zone across to the disseminated sulfide. And so they had massive reconciliation issues, but also when you are looking longer out in the next 18 months plus, you're also not optimizing your mining to these zones adequately because you're overcalling this grade. When they went back to a geologic and structural domain driven approach, which was basically mapping out these zones, this is a nice, real simple example of an estimation domain, but they immediately saw a huge difference. And so this makes total sense to us. Yet we're still seeing in industry, we're still seeing these, as René Stirk in his paper put, these bad practices can very quickly become common practices. And it's on us to call them out and do something about it. Here is a good example from Olympic Dam, my old stomping ground. I couldn't not talk about it. This is from a paper from the 2019 Mine Geology Conference. But the key point here was one of the big misnomers of Olympic Dam is, oh, you know, whenever someone comes in, lithology has got to be a significant host, significant control to mineralization, but it's just not. And this was looking at all of the composited samples in the deposit. And what we see here is that really this is all Roxby Downs granite here. The different colors, different lithotypes, really, they're different alteration of iron. It's increasing iron, the bolder the pink gets. But so you can see there's an iron control there, but it's not actually a lithologic control. So we see we have a couple of domains that are absolutely barren. And then we have a just plethora of everything can host all grades of copper. And the work that was done here a long time ago and was recognized quite early on was, out of all the things that matter, it's actually uniquely, or quite interesting, sulfide mineralogy. It's not so unique, but because Olympic Dam has a full zonation where you get hypogene chalcocite through to chalcopyrite, what we actually see is the biggest control, the most significant control on copper is actually as you shift from shallow central zones where it's chalcocite dominant, chalcocite bornite, into chalcopyrite pyrite zones. So basically you see 130% increase on copper grade, and likewise from chalcopyrite to bornite, 83%. And so fundamentally, the lithology didn't have a huge impact, even though that was a primary output of the geological model. It was actually mineralogically driven. And so we had to build there was already a workflow built, and we just built into that workflow in our geological model to make sure that those estimation domains were getting produced on top of our other standard geological modeling workflow. And so this is just a really nice example that it's absolutely deposit specific. And this wouldn't work on all copper deposits because this is hypogene chalcocite. It's not a supergene blanket overprint. It's still the same concept, still the same logic, but it'll be very spatially different in how you model it out. And so to conclude on a bit of a sensitive topic, I guess, is the most common domain that is out there right now, unfortunately, are grade shelves. And I am just a strong believer that that is not an appropriate estimation domain, unless all avenues are exhausted. I mean, if there is absolutely no geological model that exists and it's a nut job, it's a dog's breakfast of a deposit, then possibly, but I still believe that there are nonlinear estimation techniques that are a much better alternative to nesting linear estimation techniques within grade shelves. And there's an excellent paper by Xavier and Emery quite a few years ago, which basically show the grade shelves will give you a bias in grade, and the more nested shells you have, the bigger that bias will be. And I've seen so many examples of models that is exactly the true case. And unless you support it with all of the estimation parameters really well, which is difficult when it runs through the hands of so many people in these longer lived deposits, they are really more dangerous than they are valuable. So I highly recommend you, if you're a grade shell supporter, to read this paper. This is just a bit of a summary. But there are better ways to handle this. And I think Neil Schofield, he said it really well in a paper many years ago, that there's this fundamental misunderstanding on what the concept of ore is if we're using samples with cutoffs of ore and waste to be the foundation of a resource estimation. There is a fundamental problem with that. And anyway, I recommend the paper. But to my background, to summarize it all, I think that this is a workflow that needs to be built into geological modeling teams. This is one of the consequences, is as implicit modelings become more cheap and more easily accessible, and all the major software companies now offer it as a tool. Really, arguably what we've done is we've gone from really time-consuming explicit deterministic wireframing, which is very slow, it's very subjective, it's pretty much a slice in the time of the day it was built, and then typically that becomes common practice for the next however many years, which is not great. It's not very reproducible, highly subjective, but typically whenever that slice of time was, if it was done well, it's a good representation of the geology. And therefore it has some accuracy. Now, as we shift over to implicit models, they're quite precise, they're easily reproducible, which is good. You put a data set in, it is going to reproduce it. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. And the bigger the data set, the more dense the data is, the way more inconsistencies there are going to be in 3 dimensions, because essentially all those observations that we capture are pretty much one-dimensional. And so that's another topic for a different day. But what I strongly recommend to all of our geological models out there is that the most representative models are explicitly controlled implicit models. That is really truly understanding the 3D mineral patterns and controls and building those into robust estimation domains. That should be the end goal of every single geological model. And the more you can explicitly control with just a few points, and you can be very strategic in your approach, but you can get to that point where it's accurate, but also reproducible. And so that's the summary of my talk. It's a little dry. We are talking about a little bit about geostatistics here. So I hope I kept it a little bit lighthearted, but I strongly implore everyone to go and review their estimation domain. And even if it was recent, in the last few years that we went through this process, are we continuously looking at how the ore body knowledge and controls are changing at the different scales of our deposits, and make sure that they're built in, because until it's built into the resource model, really the mining value chain cannot be optimized to its best advantage. So I'll keep it there, and that's the reference list.